So hi, my name is Stephanie Maburdaw Midbid Bopapa Williams. Bopapa is my Larrakia name. Midbid and Maburdaw, they come from my father's side, my father's heritage. And Bopapa is Larrakia, my mother's side. This is my mother's country. And thank you so much for having me today.
No, thank you. When I first reached out to you to hey, let's do this truth telling on radio, I was a little bit nervous because as a settler myself, there's so much I have to learn. But since we went to the Binybara with the ongoing resistance against defense housing clearing and the truth telling and weaving workshop that you and your mom had, it was so beautiful with all these people coming together and weave. And it gave me a little bit more ideas of how do we unpack the nuance of violence. So let's start with Binybara and the significance of it to the Larrakia people.
Yeah. As I spoke about on the Truth Telling Day in the early 1970s, which wasn't too long ago, we have our original maps of Darwin and our original maps that map out our sacred sites for Larrakia people in that period of time who had got together and they painted the map sign on the back of a shed, and Binybara is there. So I've got relatives who have lived on Binybara, and we have story for Binybara that's very sacred to us, of how it was a meeting place, places where people had practice, ceremonies, so it's sacred, and it is a part of our creation story. We don't give too much of our sacred story to the public. However, my mother is a knowledge holder, and she has told me about the woman's part of why it's important for us. And there is a man's story that I don't know of, but it's important for the Larrakia men of that particular site too. But Binybara is such a beautiful place. It is on the doorstep of, our town here in Darwin, and it's a place where many people and children go to connect with country. And there are a lot of birds that are also very important that fly all the way to places like Russia and call Binybara their home, and that is where they decide to migrate back to. And that's a continuation of the cycle, and also the cycle of life. You've got our story of generations of keeping our traditions going and our ceremonies going, but a part of that ceremony is also seeing our country thrive, heal, and I think, a lot of people ask me, what is sacred about Binybara? Why is it sacred? A lot of friends that aren't Larrakia, but they are Aboriginal, and they ask me, why is Binybara sacred? You've got the bird story. You've also got a story about native bush rats that's there for the environmentalists, and then you've also got a story that Larrakia have. But I think that every part of it is sacred to me. And like my mum said today, when we chatted with her earlier, it was that, we are the land. But we're not degrading ourselves, saying that we are flora and fauna like past laws did. We're not thinking in that mindset. We're thinking in a spiritual mindset that we are the land. And it's important to protect land. And it's important to value the sacredness of land. And there is a nuance to some people with sacredness, like what is sacred to them. But in a world where we develop things and you would probably say violent. It's violent in how we, it's a quick moving world, and it's capitalism. There's all different things that are involved with colonialism. And with that, it's interesting that some people nowadays find it hard to sit down and really think about what the word sacred means. But yes, what it means to Larrakia is very different to probably what it means to other people and other people who live on this country and other families and other cultures. But what is sacred to us? And do we value the birds? Do we value people? and do we value country? Is that sacred to us? And it is definitely to me, which is a part of truth telling, is that land is sacred. Our waterways are sacred. Our stories are sacred. People are sacred. Our children are sacred. And our traditions are sacred. And our birds and our home is sacred.
Thank you. That's very beautiful to put it. I think that's a lot of First Nation elders has been telling me that the same beliefs and the way of living and being as well. And also there's an ongoing exhaustion of keep telling settlers the same thing and no one listening. So from your observation, why do you think settlers or people could like not having that sacredness connect to land, or they will put the sacredness into extracting and exploiting other people, or putting into what they believe as capital, invention of money? It would be interesting to start from there. Like, how would you observe people? How do they detach from the land from the first place?
Yeah, it's a very tough question. How do people detach from it? Because to me, I couldn't imagine detaching from it, but there is a detachment from sacredness and a detachment from land. And I think it's hard to say because this may be a bit too brutal to say, but I think that when you're dispossessed of your land, it's hard to come to terms with that detachment because you may be feeling that oppression. And when you're not grounded in it, or grounded in truth, it might be. A lot of our allies seem to understand or try to understand the oppression that First Nations people experience in a daily and also globally under these colonial oppressive systems. And with that, allies are really wonderful like yourself who can see from a different, how would I say, a different scope or maybe a different lens. I don't really know the word to articulate it, but just being able to see differently outside of yourself and what others class as sacred, and to be able to reflect and sit with that. And I think that is almost a practice, whether or not you learned that or whether or not it's just innate a part of your being, that you understand that other people value land and sea and rivers in a different way to the colonial mindset. But there are a vast majority that don't probably have that practice, and I would say it's a practice, and I'm not too sure if it's learnt or taught, because I'm even unlearning and decolonizing my own ways of thinking, and I think that that's a practice, but I do think there is this idea of a detachment, and it's not an idea, it is a fact that there is an incredible detachment from what is sacred and a detachment from First Nations truths, but that resides also in the word Terra Nullius, and I brought it up at the Weaving Day, and I wasn't too sure if I should, because it's not something that's openly spoken about. In safe spaces it is, but not in every space. First Nations people, especially here on Larrakia, Gulumirrgin country, have I heard personally that word be spoken about. But I think that word sets the precedent of detachment, and that word lives within our daily lives, and that word lives within the people who are very much detached from First Nations values and ways of being, knowing and doing. And it's all this unlearning that not only the settlers have to do, but also us as First Nations, because we've all been so incredibly oppressed. and we may not even realize it. And when we do talk about it, it seems very radical because it's not an openly spoken yet on Larrakia Gulumirrgin country. That, yeah, and I've only just come to that understanding just having this yarn with you, that I do think potentially it is Terra Nullius that's the precedent of why people are detached from Binybara and why people are detached in general to the truths of Larrakia Gulumirrgin people.
Thank you. Terra Nullius is definitely one of the most violent ideology imposed on this continent, because even when I encounter with indigenous scholars overseas, they all would refer back to the case here in terms of Terra Nullius. Especially when I was reading through some early documents of how they define Terra Nullius is like not saying there's no people here, but it's like saying there's no agricultural practice, so there's no civilization. And this is how the colonizer thinks and try to diminish someone as less human into their version of human and version of civilization. So yeah, definitely good to start from there as well, because let's see how do you see Terra Nullius unfold today, like in the structures, because we also talk about crown land, we also talk about all these colonial structure attached to the invention of land, reinvention of land, I would say. Yeah, how do we navigate it?
Yeah, I really love the word you just used, reinvention of land. And I have never thought of it in that type of way, but it's true, because we've put a word on a continent when there are that many tribes with different dialect of language, and that in itself diminishes, the people, because you've said that, their practices are primitive, their practices are savage, they are savage, and they're barbaric, and, we want to learn and live a civilized way, and we'll bring people to colonize and make this our country and make it civilized, and bring in civilized ways of living, being, knowing and doing, and we'll call it, this whole area, one name that resonates to us. Yeah, so it is an incredible reinvention that completely abolishes is a very strong word to use, but it abolishes First Nations values and practices, because it's saying that our ways of looking at the stars are not as intellectual, our ways of kinship and how we intermarry and how we've survived for many thousands of years isn't worthy, and it isn't civilized. So yeah, I like the word you used just then, reinvention. But I think that's something that I'll be pondering on for a while now, because it is a reinvention of a continent, but also of a history of a place too, because we're only acknowledging one part of history. And you using that word has made me forget the actual question that you've just said. But I'm like, wow, I love that word. I think that's really sparked something in me, but I love it because it's a reinvention. It's a reinvention because realistically, there was already people here and their practices were so complex and kept them into, for many generations. My practices of my people have kept us, and it was it was so incredible that there's some words I can't even really articulate how incredible they are, because they're obviously sitting with country. Old people sat with country and knew the tides, knew the winds, had songlines that were about the winds and songlines about the seasons changing, and adapted with the seasons and adapted their lives to the seasons, which is so advanced. And now we're kind of like, as scientists, we're making these rediscoveries, but it's stuff that First Nations people have always known. But, you know, not to discount scientists, but, you know, there's Western knowledge that still doesn't, you know, acknowledge that these traditional practices, they can coexist with each other, but also they already existed because it is a reinvention. So, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I remember there's a lot of great scholars from India that wrote about how science as a strong colonial force to erase First Nation knowledge, especially like it just switched the whole focus from conservation into extraction, and I think that's very much resonate, and especially in India, there's like a lot of cases of how science is like being used to justify the mass agricultural project that leads to famine, actually. So, and I think it's also applied here where science continue to be a violence actors of, you know, promoting the concept of quantum blood, that you have to prove your identity in order to segregate you into fundings and to resource. And that's like, you know, further harming someone's, like denying someone's just the beliefs and the being of what culture and land they attached to. So yeah, I think it would be nice to go back to like the questions of Terra Nullius and how. So I was thinking of like, you know, how do we unpack different colonial structures in details, such as in your different work and everyday living? How do you see the system, let's say crown land, that it's say like the land is belong to the crown, and it kind of intensified after the Northern Intervention when there was like the township leasing. They were like leasing the crown land to the Commonwealth for 99 years in the term of economic development. But we all know this is just concentration of control. So yeah, I think a lot of people like, I'm just thinking of all these things because of how do we unpack Terra Nullius for people to actually understand it and for public education purpose.
Unpacking Terra Nullius, I think it's to understand the relationship between the Balanda and the First Nations people, and to really look into history from not the colonial lens that we've been looking at for such a very long time. It's not a long time, it's only been 200 years, so it's still all these concepts, if you will, are still somewhat new, and even more new on Larrakia Gulumirrgin country, that I think for public, we allies Larrakia are the First Nations group who call this place their home. It's a lot of learning about the impacts and how Terra Nullius impacted the Larrakia people, and so the language isn't spoken fluently. And why is that? You may not always see acknowledgements on buildings on Larrakia Gulumirrgin country of the First Nations people. And why is that? You don't necessarily know the history of the people of this country, but why is that? There's all these whys, and I think as a young Larrakia I have these whys, but I often research my own history so that I can make sense of the whys, so that I can kind of think about what Terra Nullius did to my people, and how does this affect us in today's life. And you're right, the intervention is, and also the pre-existing laws, and how you show your identity as an Aboriginal person, proof of Aboriginality forms. We have to have a paper document in order to get study and things like that. You must show these things, but also quantum, the conversations there were, from the stolen generation, words used such as half caste, full blood, quarter caste, and those words are incredibly divisive, however are still used some to this day, and they are not appropriate to use on a human being because, you know, their similar words were used in breeding cattle, and yet they were used on Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people, First Nations people in Australia. And what does that do to your mind in making a casting system? Because it, you know, that's impacts of Terra Nullius, because I think if Terra Nullius didn't exist, then potentially those laws at the period of time that allowed for that terminology to be used may not have existed either, because we would have all just been considered worthy. However, it enabled, if you will, these laws that always seem to be divisive and disempower First Nations people, disempower First Nations voices. And Terra Nullius also, and this whole book that doesn't necessarily validate First Nations people being owners of land, initially when they first had come. Now we have land rights laws, we have native title laws, but they still may not have the same amount of weight in acknowledging sovereignty. So not all people like it. And now treaty is being introduced in other places in Australia. So we're slowly kind of healing from the word Terra Nullius, but I still think, like you've made great points of, that there are all these things that are laws that have been put in place, systems put in place to prove yourself as an Aboriginal person. And they still somehow live in our day-to-day lives. I think that I love to learn about history because it heals me and it's healing. So I think if we can heal country physically by healing the land, giving Binybara a place to rejuvenate and a place for our, story and ceremony to continue, and also the birds to continue their songline and their cycle of life. We've also need to introduce the history back and the importance of it, because it'll help the country sing, because it's been oppressed so long and potentially kept silent for so long. So I think that's what's going to help country heal. I think that allies like yourself and other people I value really highly, because I think that helps our country heal, in a sense that we are now call Darwin our home, and Larrakia country is home to many. And if we all had a respect of the history and the impacts of Terra Nullius, whether that was the stolen generations, the casting systems, dispossession of land, massacres, and all the other tragic stories of colonialism that had happened on Larrakia, Gulumoerrgin country and in the Northern Territory, when we sit with that and we all know that, the brutal truths, I think that healing can happen. For now, truth-telling is just a new concept that I hope will help us open the door and the gateway to having the more harsher topics of conversation with, those in the community. But it's also the willingness to learn and educate, because a part of this is also education, and education is incredibly empowering. So if we can empower it with more First Nations values, history, and make it a part of our daily practice, whether that's in the schools for the young children or in the universities, that we're making sure that it is talked about, because that is creating a safe space. And then what does that do to the people, and what does it do to the country? Well, it heals them, it heals us, it heals the land, and it heals that word that we all have been so incredibly, devastatingly under Terra Nullius. But yeah.
Wow. Wow, that's such a beautiful way to put it. I think because a lot of us always forget about the healing part, and that perpetuate the violence. I also think about like the other question I was asking you before. When we try to heal country, we always resolve into a parliamentarian democracy approach. Like say, oh, if we get enough representatives in the parliaments, then we could like take over and then we could implement law to heal country. But for me, it never works like that, because if you look at like 99% of the land in the occupied Northern Territory are stewarded by First Nation people, but they only represent only a few seats in the parliament, and most of the people in the parliaments are people from the suburb, living detached from land. So I think that's why I'm also curious when we talk about allyship, like myself. A lot of people see allyship as going forward into the election pathway. How do we approach that? Because like it's always feel like, oh, this is the solution, but I personally don't believe it is. Yeah.
Well, I think another conversation is this idea of, for us on Larrakia Gulumirrgin country, the revival of our language, the revival of, history, and making sure that it's being taught to create that awareness that then creates a safe space that then affects our sphere of influence, that could hopefully then lead to the potential of having more of a voice, because then potentially we would have more, we could gain respect. But I do think that is the kind of trajectory moving forward, and the hope is that in phases it's the healing from colonialism and Terra Nullius. It's, it's starting very little to truth telling, that then opens up the, gateway to then having the conversations about what happened on the country, and then getting ourselves more healed and stronger, country healed, country strong, to then discuss, okay, well, we want to bring back our, old ways of being, knowing and doing in a Western setting, but that also means that we need to bring back our governance systems, our traditional governance systems. And what did that look like a long time ago? There was, in Larrakia Gulumirrgin tradition, there was a clan that is head clan and tribe, and Larrakia had their way, their law, their gwalwa on this country, and their ways of being, knowing and doing, but it all happened with their own traditional governance. Nowadays I see our old people, our Dariba, our Narri, our elders, so old men, old women, as our governance, and we need to make sure that they feel elevated, heard, seen, worthy, whilst they've experienced a lot more colonial oppression than I have. I've only been on this earth for 24 years. They've been here for a lot longer. So my job as a young person is, I feel like my cultural load in this Western setting is, how can I help my old people to heal? Because in my eyes, they are governance system. They are my governance system. They govern what I do, and they should have the right to govern their country, because they've, lived such a long life on their country. Our elders need to be protected just as much as our children do. They're very sacred. Elders are sacred. I forgot to mention elders earlier when I was talking about sacredness of country, but yes, the sacredness of our elders and our head people, to protect them and help them make decisions, and trust in their discernment to make the decisions for themselves, and empower the young people coming through. But in doing that, we don't forget the governance systems of allowing, all of our countrymen, our people, to have a voice, is allowing our elders to really feel like they are respected elders, and they are sacred too. So, part of that is governance, and how can we get that traditional aspect of governance and elders to also be able to have a say in parliamentary settings when it comes to making decisions for the Northern Territory. And, you know, that may not just be for Larrakia, that could be considering a lot of other people who call the Northern Territory their home, is how do we get our elders, or people's voices, but particularly our elders, who are respected elders within their community, to have more of a say in what affects them, you know, what policing in their community affects them, what the rises of, you know, fuel and food in their communities, you know, things like financial supports that they need more of, protection of their sacred sites. Like governance is a very important part, but traditional governance. But what I think I'm trying to get to is getting our traditional governance systems, elders are respected by a Western government that sees, you know, you need to have a doctorate to be respected, or you need to have something to be respected, whereas not everybody can achieve that level of education. However, in a traditional sense, they are above many because they have done a lot of ceremony to get to where they are. Therefore, they are the governance of their community, or they're respected and they've lived a long time serving their community, and now they've moved into the role of being an elder for their community. And how can we get their voices acknowledged by the Northern Territory government in a parliamentary electoral way? And yeah, it's definitely, the trajectory is starting with the truth telling, allowing voices to be elevated, elders to be elevated, our children to be protected, sacred sites protected, revival, healing, and then whilst constantly persisting to have our Dariba Narri have their voices be heard, and elevate them. Because if you think about it, Terra Nullius has existed for so long, or 200 years, it feels very long for a lot of us, and we've only been here for a short amount of time. How do our Dariba Narri feel, who have been here for much longer? They would feel, you know, like they would probably feel a lot worse, I would think, that they've been under this oppression for so long. And it's an important thing too. It takes a bit of being humble as a young person to say, like, I really want my elders to be recognised and heard and seen and valued for who they are culturally in a Western setting. But yeah, I make it part of my daily practice to respect my Dariba Narri and learn from them, but listen and validate, but also comfort them when they feel like these laws are so oppressive, and don't give them the weight that it deserves, because, you know, they can't protect their sea and water and sacred country, Larrakia Gulumoerrgin, for the given laws that we have right now. So we're down to heritage laws and laws about the environment, because we're not fully recognised as of yet. But my hope is that some laws will change in the future, but also that we're able to get traditional governance systems recognised in a parliamentary Western government setting in the Northern Territory, and hopefully across Australia.
Thank you. That's a beautiful way to put it. Also like to ask, do you get inspired by other First Nation governance systems in other part of the world as well, that you say like, hey, this is how they resist and find their own ground again? Just asking if you get any inspirations.
Within Australia, definitely the East Coast, I really do love the way they revive their language and heal country, and elders' voices are very much respected, and they are unified in one mob, and allies are very strong there too, in particular Melbourne. I haven't travelled many places. I've been to Hawaii and New Zealand, and I learnt a little bit about the Hawaiian colonial oppression that they've received, but I was very young. I was only 12, so it's just a little touch of, and the rest I was just grasping, like, oh, they've been colonized just like us, but at that age I kind of still sort of understood. And then I've been to New Zealand, and obviously they've had a different history, and they've got treaty there and what that's done for them. But I haven't had the conversations personally with a Māori person to see how that sits for them. Is treaty good for them? Do they enjoy treaty? But I would love to, because from an outsider's perspective, we may think their country might look better than Australia, but we don't necessarily know their perspective fully, if it actually is from what it looks like from the outward looking in. But I would love to go to Canada. I know I've just been reading, and I was yarning with a friend of my mother's who had come back to Larrakia, Gulumirrgin country. Hadn't seen her for a long time, but she's had worked a lot for many years in Canada, and had told me a bit about their struggles and finding the remains of young people, of their people, from the destruction of colonialism and the violence. And you mentioned that word earlier, violence, the violence that had occurred on their country. And it got me thinking, like, how they're moving forward, and truth-telling is definitely coming in very strong for them. And I admire that, because I think that I'd like to know how they feel truth-telling can help them, because some people may not see the power in truth-telling, or the power in having these types of conversations, like you say, living in a more perhaps Western, or what was the word you used?
Just a structure of
suburban, I think it was.
Yeah, the suburban environment. Yeah.
Living in a suburban environment. Yeah, I think that definitely changes their scope too. And I think, yarning with other people who have worked in many different countries, especially like yourself, I do look to other people for advice or their own perspective on things. And I really do appreciate this interview, because it's getting me to think a different way and from a different lens, and use different terminology. Because sometimes we can't articulate it, First Nations people, and we're speaking in the colonial tongue, English, and we're trying to navigate their systems, navigate their words, navigate their intellect, navigate their way they articulate things, to try and be on par, coexist, to then try and have power, not power necessarily, but be empowered. It's really hard to be empowered using the colonial art terminology, if that makes sense. So to thinking on their wavelength, and thinking about how they kind of move and operate using their language and their tongue, is a strategy and game in itself. Because we're trying to, I suppose, decolonize while speaking their language. So it's a lot of thinking happening, but a lot of strategy and a lot of confusion. But it's a very powerful thing, truth telling, and I like that other countries are in their own phases of truth telling. They may look more advanced, maybe from the outsider perspective, other First Nations people around the world, but I think at different phases in their life, truth telling, and it might even be everyday practice to truth tell, because it's just about telling your truth about oppression and violence and colonialism, and telling your truth and how you navigate the systems. And yeah, I look to other people who have experienced oppression, whether they're First Nations or minority groups, because I think that there is a lot of unlearning that needs to happen, because we're very much in one narrow way of thinking in our daily lives. So yeah, like I said earlier, the word I use is making it a part of my practice to try and unlearn, but to also learn at the same time.
Yeah. We all are unlearning, I think, for life, I would guess, because we all still attached to this system of violence and continue to harm land. Yeah, I'm just thinking about like when you talk about language, because English is my third language, but it's like at the same time my first two languages is also a settler language to some extent, so I don't actually have a language that is attached to land. It's like all the language I know is very much based on a system of oppression and extractions. So I'm still finding my tongue to like reconnect, because one of my main dream in my life is like I'll go back to the Sinosphere in China, because I know the language, and how do I actually reconnect with the land there, because it's so vast, there's so much oppression history that people don't talk about, and the history book which is constantly changing every year. So I think people just losing direction of which truth-telling direction and fight they have to go through as well. But there is still a lot of First Peoples in the western part of so-called China, where they still persist their own way of living with the land, being part of the land. But obviously that is always facing the rapid developmentalism of China to become the world factories, to take more land, to produce more stuff. So yeah, just my own my own little dreams to do one day to go back and do that. But it's really good to learn that here, because growing up in Hong Kong, a lot of people, the mindset is very prone to American imperialism. They're like, oh, America's good because they could help us to resist China, but they don't really think, or they don't actually know the history of oppression, or even if they know, it's like, well, that's life. So it's very normalized, the violence, and I think it's a lot of work that sometimes I fall into my shoulder as well. Like, how do I address it as someone who know the language, and I think that there will be the question as well, like, because when you're doing truth telling, like, maybe some people would think, oh, don't lecture me, like, because like I know my way. But at the same time, it's like my friend was saying, like, if we are doing mutual aid work, then people are actually understanding, discovering the violence by themselves instead of people telling them and they don't accept it. So have you also like went through that as well, when people like doesn't believe what you're saying, and then you try another way to get them to discover themselves?
Yeah, I think the idea of people not listening and people not taking on truth telling, or thinking that it's a bit airy-fairy, like it's, maybe it's a bit too it's interesting that the word woke is used to degrade, but it's like I think my concept of truth telling is to create a safe space for all Larrakia Gulumirrgin people. And when I did the Weaving Truth Telling Day, I really wanted it to be an open mic, so anybody could come up and speak your truth. So I understand that my truth is different, my lived experiences is different, my life has been different, and that as human beings, we're all very much spiritual beings, and we've all had different experiences in our lives. And within Larrakia Gulumirrgin people, we have our history, but each family or each individual may have a different truth but has been oppressed. So it was more so introducing the concept of being able to feel liberated to speak your truth. And it's a practice that for a long time in Western societies that we hadn't really done if it wasn't for First Nations people, or just allowing human beings to feel seen, valued, heard, respected. And that may be for Aboriginal people, that may be for, gay people, that may be for our trans community, that may be for a lot of different diverse backgrounds, because I understand everybody has their truth and their own lived experience. And for Larrakia Gulumirrgin people, ours is more about being oppressed underneath colonial laws, which stems from Terra Nullius. Our children being taken in the stolen generations, dispossession of land, and still we are dispossessed of land. However, we still call ourselves custodians of the land. And so it was introducing the concept in a Western society that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to feel. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be upset that you're oppressed. And it's okay to speak about oppression. So just a small introductory into allowing people to feel safe, seen, valued, and heard. Because I think that's how you heal in a Western society, is allowing the daily practice of allowing people to feel seen, valued, and heard. And in return, the atmosphere of our country will change. I believe it does. And it gives me a sense of hope, because I would be very gloomy, and sometimes I am, underneath oppression and colonialism. And I have experienced being silenced. I've experienced a lot of racism in my life, and I've experienced, I have my mother's side that is Larrakia, which is here, and a lot of people, like you said earlier, it looks very suburban to some. However, she, to me, is a knowledge keeper of old practices, because she had sat with her old people in this country who are no longer here. So I learned from her in a suburban setting. And my father is a traditional man. So he has his ceremony, he has his practices, and his language spoken fluently. So that is chalk and cheese, if you will. However, his people is a small tribe, because, we'd also experienced massacres on that country. It is documented in history, not very spoken about openly, because it is very tragic, but a lot of our people had gone through that from the violence. So I've experienced historically on both sides. One side, Larrakia, is a loss of language. My father's side, a loss of tribe, what I think is loss of family members, because we're a very small tribe, because what I think is potentially because of that. And we've survived and kept the resistance just by existing. So on both sides of me, in my ancestry, have experienced the violence of, historically colonialism. And then in my day-to-day life, in living in the colony of Australia, I've experienced a lot of racism. And I think it's because people, like you say, always question your identity, and they can't seem to understand how you can be an Aboriginal person but speak English and have concepts and ideas, or even be educated, because there's this really colonial concepts that people have, or people call them stereotypes, but I think they're from colonialism, to just kind of keep you in a box of what an Aboriginal should be. And that's why I understand that every individual is a human being, a spiritual being, and is different. So I don't kind of hold any Aboriginal or Larrakia person to just one way of being, because you are your own person with your own autonomy. And I think for myself and living in the colony and experiencing racism, I'd always been what I felt was gaslit. And even some other, maybe other Aboriginal people who hadn't experienced the same levels of racism, or maybe didn't know that they were even experiencing it, would say like, oh, well, what do you mean by that? I haven't, but that was my experiences in the growing up here in the colony. And it's because like I probably don't fit the stereotypes of what an Aboriginal person should be, and I understand that, and I know that, I have I have darker skin, and I have, I might not dress the same as other people. I may not look traditional to a Ballanda person. I may not look worthy to some people. People that look like me aren't necessarily on our Australian TV shows. I never grew up with seeing people who looked like me represented in Parliament, and I still haven't seen somebody who has a similar journey or a similar life or, similar aesthetic, if you will, that has looked like me. So I've always felt somewhat alone, because I've always thought differently, I think differently, and I challenge my ways of thinking in the colony. And you probably wouldn't know that some people look at you like you are a bit crazy and radicalized. And you've got to choose your words wisely when you pick a crowd, I guess. When you read the room and see if anybody else thinks you're crazy, then you just keep it, and then figure it out if they think you're crazy. But it was interesting. So I started to understand, and I had to heal from even experiencing racism and the way people would treat me. And as a young kid, experiencing casual racism. I remember saying to a young boy, I'm really proud of being an Aboriginal, and he said to me, oh, is it so you can sit on the side of the road and beg for money? And I was like, no, and I got really upset, but that was his opinion as a little boy. And all these just bizarre conversations you have throughout your life in my 24 years, so I feel a lot older than 24, and I feel like I've experienced it all. And your trauma, they say that when you've got a darker complexion, I don't know if it's true, that sometimes you're seen as a threat, because it sounds brutal to say the racist mind, but I would think it's the colonial mind. It is the racist mind. But so I think that I've had to unlearn, and I try to, but I still find myself doing it. It was just throughout my life to try and make myself feel maybe not seen as much, so I'm not a threat, or potentially being a bit more quiet, and I wonder if that's actually my personality, or if it's just being suppressed under colonial structures. Yeah, you're like, Steph, you're suppressed, girl. You're not crazy. Yeah, but I had always tried to make myself, smaller for others to feel safe. But I understand now at 24 years old that my whole life I was just making myself smaller to fit into these colonial structures. And so I was just introducing at the weaving day that it's okay to speak your truth. But a part of my truth is acknowledging that I am probably not the same as others, but I understand that other people are not the same as me. And even experiencing racism, as you would know, in Western colonial societies, you're often gaslit to think you're crazy, or to think that it's not colonialism. And other people who may live, like you said, it might be suburban or it might be colonized ways of living, or their minds may be more colonial, or they just may not be aware of colonialism, that they don't understand what racism really is, and that Terra Nullius to me is very racist, and our country is founded off a racist system. And so really we're all just surviving in a very racist, and you would say violent system, which I need to start using that term too, because it's the truth. And that is a part of truth telling, is that to treat anybody less than any human being is violent. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing the experience, because like when people think about racism, they only think about, oh, it's just my thinking, but they don't realize it's a whole system imposed of it. And the most best example is like prison labor, which is modern slavery, because how much should they get paid? But it's, when they're targeting on First Nation children's and then put them in like prison for like cheap labor. And that's what's happening in Turtle Island with ICE. They're putting in like migrants into facilities for cheap labor. But people just like, oh, they're criminals. Oh, they are. So I think like this is the thing we need to unpack what racism actually is the whole invention of racial science is based on slavery, so that the white Europeans can be extracting labor from people. And it's funny because like the word slave it actually starts from Slavic, means Eastern European. So yeah, so they're the original slavery labor. And what happened is like when they were being brought to the America for the colonial explorations, because they look more alike in skin color, so they run away. And people like the Africans who got brought about because of the skin color, it's harder for them to run away and blend in to the settler colonial society. So it is also skin color that contribute to that history of racism and the foundation of slavery as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That is an incredible gem to know, even though it's so sad. It's very sad when you think about the oppression of the world, and that it stems from something as simple as the color of skin, but is ongoing because it is slavery. And I like that you were able to see a community of people who are oppressed, may not know they're oppressed, but understand where it has stemmed from. But I do think that this conversation is a part of truth telling, and I'm really happy that I learnt that today, because I'll have to have you explain that to my mother too, so we can unpack that if you would like one day. But I'm so
bring food.
yeah, you're bringing the food, exactly. But it does heal. It is such a daunting thing to come to the realization that there's all these oppressive things that have happened of the world, but like a jigsaw puzzle, it all connects. And I think furthermore conversations need to be had so that we can understand the oppression that's happening here and where it's all come from, because it is settler colonialism and it's introduced. And where have these concepts come from? Because it's not from here, it came from overseas. And even that concept, from where did they get that concept from? Those systems from? And develop them to disempower races all over the world and make money and profit, and leave a lot of tribes despaired.
Absolutely. Do you have any questions for me as well?
Any questions? I do have a question, because earlier on today I said I'm not too sure if it's learnt, allyship, or if it's taught. And how do you think allyship, is it a learnt behavior? Is it a practice? And how did you develop your practice? And how do you also develop yourself in everyday practice of, like you said, unlearning and decolonizing?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I actually hate the word allyship. I actually prefer the word accomplice, Because allyship, you could be like, oh, I support, but I'm not doing anything. But accomplice is like, you support, but you have to go in to do the work. And that's why I prefer, because always you're just part of the problem, right? So I come from Hong Kong. Growing up, like, doesn't know any violence in the world because you're part of the problem. And I moved to this side of the world, to this beautiful country 6 years ago. And I started like hanging out with, actually the first elder who taught me about all this history of violence was Auntie June Mills. So shout out to her, who actually like would sit down and tell me stuff, and really appreciate it, because otherwise I would not actually reveal my whole being or how I live my life or the system and structure I rely on. So and I started going to the street protests and learning from people, because if you make friends on the street, it's more authentic than making in the conference. And I start hanging out with Auntie Crystal Love as well, because sadly Auntie June Mills was got evicted a few years ago, and it's very hard to like just go and hang out with her because it's very unstable with communication and network, and there was like COVID at that time. And then Crystal was like, yeah, we'll do something together, and that's how we started trying to give like some sort of self-sovereignty and determination project on Tiwi Island for the sister girls. But it's also like very tricky, because everything you navigate in the colonial system is revolve around money and capital, and that's not how country functions, because you don't wait for funding for things to happen seasonal, right? So I think that's a massive contradiction, and then that's when I realized this is a apartheid of two worldviews. It's like not just apartheid of people, but apartheid of the way of people see and live life. For example, like apartheid, like people suburban, would be continue to extraction of the world resource of the global south, to sustain their own life, to hoard land and wealth. But the other side, as you said, is a custodianship of the land. And for me, this is a part of apartheid as well, not just about based on race and skin color, but based on the way that people, being and then perceive and care for as well. There's a quote from a Mayan writer, Linda Kukovics. She said, when nobody remembers their part of the land, their life and desire will revolve towards capital. And I think that's very much resonates from my understanding, and also like the continuing of unlearning, because we all still trying to survive with that bit of money in these colonial structures. So I think but it really helps, because it's like you say, it's a really powerful truth-telling practice to keep reviewing what I'm doing is actually caring for land, or aligning to the custodianship and stewardship with beings and spirits, and to the birds, to even to the rocks, and to everything is connected. And I think that's such a beautiful way to put it. And it really helps me to there's also a lot of allies who follow more of the Marxist, Leninist, and the socialist pathway of we need mass organization, we need to dismantle the rich, wealthy class. But for me, this is also, what you're proposing is a mass extraction. You're not actually dismantling a system that is harming the land. So I think, that's why I told my friend the other day, it was being detached from the land is the greatest psychological operation, militarization that has done to us, the whole global, because we all experience the same situation of forgetting we're part of the land. So I think that has been quite powerful for me to understand, all right, where do I have to situation myself to do the work for education, for understanding where is the structure of violence happen, because they have names of CEOs, there's names of colonizers. And once we know that, we have to staff the system. We have to staff them so the other side can heal, can thrive, to go back to the seasonal change instead of disruption of funding, disruption of developmentalism projects, of gas projects, of housing projects. So I think that's where I'm at. But obviously, as a settlers, it's also like a very high privilege for me to like learn all this stuff, because like I have a job to enable me to learn this stuff. So there's a inherent contradiction, right? Like I told like your mom saying like, academia is an extractive system in itself, which is true because they're not doing anything, There's like so much violence by not doing it, by not saying it, by staying silent. And I think like, especially when CDU in itself has a strong ties with military that contribute to bombing in Palestine, to helping the same colonial system to continue killing people who care for land. And it's the same for prison systems that steal children from communities so they can't become the next generation to care for land, So I think when I switch my whole focus on thinking about land care, being part of the land, that really helps me to continue that motivation, because as like you said, it's a very lonely process when no one believes you and think you're crazy, right? So I think that's really helped, like even connecting people who know what I'm saying or actually been through that process longer than I do. And I think that's very beautiful. So I'm still a very new learner into how do we unpack those violence and in order for country to heal, and not using this language anymore, actually trying to learn the language that's embedded into the land and come from the land. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And you're so right there, because I suppose land care has always been my upbringing, because I'd always been on country with my mother, and she was also privileged in a sense that her first jobs were always enabling her to care for land, but it was more from a Western science perspective. However, she's just adapted it to her own ways of living and knowing and being doing, in studying her ethnobotany, and she studied that, so she knows her the colonizer words for all of the plants, but then she speaks it in her mother tongue and her father tongue, and revives that for her own healing. But yeah, she's kind of just learned how to adapt her life to heal herself, however learning the Western ways of, and she does it really well, a lot better than me, living in the Western ways of being in academia. And for myself, it's just learning how I can learn the traditional ways of her, respect my elders, because they all to me are a part of land and land care. And I love, you brought up Auntie June. I remember being a little girl and my mother had taken me to visit Auntie June. So, there's always been an idea that I would connect with the elders and, respect them and their custodialship, but also to that next level, their governance, because that is land care. To me, it is in my practice. But I think I really love hearing your practice. A lot of unlearning for me, because allyship, you don't like that word, but I think you're right there, because I use it because it's the only word that I know, and in the East Coast it's a very popular one. But however, a lot of sovereign First Nations people do not like that word, and I've never been able to find another word, but I like the way that word resonates with you, because it is a word that can seem really tokenistic, and you don't necessarily have to fulfill an obligation. Make it a part of your daily practice to elevate voices but of other oppressed people, races, minority groups, and you can just be, there. Yes, status quo, yeah, and it might just benefit you socially. But if you're taking it to that next level of, making it a part of your daily practice, and you're constantly thinking about ways to allow all people to feel safe, and it does really come down to land care. You're so right, because we are all a part of the land, and not in a Western way of classing us as animals and birds, but like a spiritual way, that we are all very much spiritual beings and who are worthy of being seen, valued and heard and respected. But yeah, thank you for having a yarn with me today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Steffi. Hopefully we'll check in again, and see where we're at and get to inspire each other again, and that'll be great. Yeah, thanks. Yes. Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.